Hello and welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Kukulkan. In the last presentation, I elaborated upon the concept of ego death and gave various descriptions of this experience that are found within psychology, mythology, and psychedelic research. I also outlined the relationship that I discovered between Venus, or the morning star, with magic mushrooms, and the effect that the psychedelic compound found in these magic mushrooms has in terms of ego dissolution. In today's presentation, I'm going to elaborate on an experience of rebirth that I had when using the psychedelic plant medicine ayahuasca. This experience occurred during my third time drinking ayahuasca, a brew that originates from the jungles of South America. The first two encounters that I had with this substance were profound, to say the least. However, the reason that I'm focusing on this third experience is because of the content that occurred within this journey and how this relates to the work of Stanislov Grof in his concept of Basic Perinatal Matrices, which refer to the stages of development within the womb and the experience of the birthing process itself. Much of Grof's work focuses on resolving elements of birth trauma that continue to cycle through the nervous system throughout later life as we continue to recreate experiences and opportunities for the resolution of these earlier traumatic encounters that occurred in the womb and during delivery. It has been my experience that in the lead up to attending this type of psychedelic plant medicine ceremony, that the inner wheels of transformation begin ticking over within our psyche well before the actual encounter, that prepares us on multiple levels for the experience that we're about to have. I could also describe the lead up to these encounters with the likes of ayahuasca as interactions with the spirit of that plant teacher that take place prior to actually ingesting it physically, as a multi-dimensional aspect of ourselves begins to interact with this plant spirit in other realms. For me, in the 2 nights leading up to this particular ceremony, I found myself bilocated whilst asleep in my bed. I was simultaneously aware that I was in bed and that my body was tossing and turning, but also that my consciousness was in another realm, which felt very familiar and I could describe as feeling very much like home. When I ingested the ayahuasca tea during that journey, it became obvious that I had been in the same realm whilst dreaming the previous 2 nights. In my first 2 experiences previously with ayahuasca, the effects of the plant medicine came on very quickly and I was vomiting within the first 15 to 20 minutes. One of the main lessons that I took away from those first 2 journeys was simply to surrender to the effects of that medicine and not to fight it. I went into this third journey prepared to surrender completely after drinking the brew. However, this time there was simply no, or seemingly no, effect, and I sat in warrior position meditating for about the first hour, waiting for the usually very strong effects to break down and rip apart my sense of self-identity. After an hour or so, the group was offered a second cup of the brew, and seemingly nobody else in the circle was feeling the effects either, as nobody had purged or seemed to be journeying, and everybody sat up to drink another cup when offered. I was prepared to drink again to initiate the effects. However, as the others in the circle drank, I began to feel the effect come on, as the group field of energy began to morph and accommodate this second ingestion. I was the last in the circle, and when it came my time to drink the tea, I decided that rather than being completely turned inside out as I was accustomed to, that I would just have a light dose and observe the effects for everybody else that evening, and perhaps I'd have a larger dose the following night. So I didn't have the second cup that it was offered to me, and I soon discovered that it was not necessary. Shortly after everybody else had drank the second cup, the facilitators turned off the music that they'd been playing and they began to sing together. And I was enjoying the sound of their voices immensely. I entered into this very childlike state of joy and began observing the effects of their singing on my body, which began dancing like a marionette puppet while lying on the floor. Each limb of my body was seemingly doing its own dance, independent of each other. And my body was so hypersensitive to the musical frequencies and was responding as though it was being danced by the wavelengths without any conscious effort on my behalf to dance. At this point, I realized that I was actually in a very altered state of consciousness, but I didn't have any of the usual psychedelic fractal landscapes in my inner vision that I'd previously become accustomed to from the effects of DMT that I found in the ayahuasca brew. This journey was more of a felt bodily experience at this stage. I felt that this experience of my limbs dancing was so joyful and funny that it made me smile, and I began to laugh joyfully a great deal. When they had finished their singing and began to play some gentle music over the stereo again, my body began to go into this wriggling motion, which I'd encountered in previous journeys, and I felt like my body was like a bag filled with snakes. All the areas of my body continued to move in this wriggling motion, which at times became quite painful. I was thoroughly enjoying the soft and prolonged rhythms of the music that we were listening to, which allowed me to go deeper and deeper into my experience, rather than being disturbed and jolted by the changing of music that I'd experienced in previous journeys. And after a while, I somehow became aware that I was having an experience inside of a womb. This was experienced as though I was floating in the vastness of space. And upon discovering this, I also became aware that my higher self was with me. The way that I encountered the higher self at that time was in the form of a playful trickster that looked like me and had all the qualities of the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. It would firstly begin to appear in one place above me and then say, "Look, I'm down here," and it would be below me, grinning at me. The next moment it would be back up above me, laughing at me again and showing me that it could be anywhere that it liked. Having this direct interaction with my higher self, I was wanting to know how I could fully merge with it, and so I asked the question, "How can I merge with you?" And it began laughing at me, saying, "You don't need to. I am you. I am always with you. I'm the part of you that exists outside the limitations of time and space." And the higher self then began showing me numerous times that it had directly made its presence known by intervening at times throughout my life. It reminded me of a time when I was a child and it had woken me up in my sleep. During this childhood encounter, the first time that it had awakened me, I opened my eyes and everything in my vision was white, and I began rubbing my eyes, thinking that they were clouded over, perhaps from some mucus that was in them, and then I lay down and went back to sleep. The presence had then woken me up again and instructed me to get out of bed, and I walked through my bedroom towards the door in this white haze with my arms outstretched. And when I opened the door, I saw that an entire wall of the adjoining lounge room was on fire. So I ran to my parents' bedroom to wake them up, opened their door, and I was stuttering from fright, saying, "Fire!" And my dad then ran out to gather my sister from her bedroom that was next to mine, then proceeded to get the garden hose and put out the fire that had occurred due to an older style of wood heater that had combusted the wooden walls of the house. So my higher self was showing me this and many other occurrences as a child when it had been with me and had precognitively pointed out things before they were about to happen, such as a car crash that I had witnessed whilst visiting a neighbour's farm with my father. The higher self had spoken to me through my best friend that was a teddy bear for many years that I'd slept with every night, as well as my imaginary friend Michael that I used to chat with as I strolled around the family farm. As these scenes continued to unfold during the ayahuasca journey, I felt that the constant movement of my limbs was becoming uncomfortable, and that perhaps I should try to calm myself down by breathing calmly and placing one hand over my chest and one over my abdomen and just consciously trying to relax. So I did that. And then out of nowhere, this feminine voice that I had previously come to recognize as the spirit of ayahuasca firmly spoke to me, saying, "Do you really think that you can control the timing of a birth?" The magnitude of this question and the subsequent awareness of the process that I was in this womb humbled me, and I apologized for attempting to control what was going on, and I then allowed my body to go back into this process of wriggling and unwinding itself as it had been. As this process of bodily unwinding occurred, a myriad of feelings began to arise. Overall, I was feeling completely lost in many areas of my life at that particular time. I felt a great sense of attachment to the relationship that I was having at that time, which I could intuit prior to the ceremony was about to come to a devastating end, and I was wanting to hold on to that. Eventually, after several hours had passed, I finally needed to purge by vomiting into a bucket that was provided, and when I did, I was aware that I was ridding myself of a bunch of stored emotional baggage that had occurred when I was about 3 years old. And I looked into the bucket, and it seemed like a bottomless pit of blackness that just went on forever and ever. After this purge, I lay back down and continued to be with these feelings for a while, but then some music came on that disturbed me, and all of a sudden the visual components of DMT began to come on, and this was completely overwhelming for me. Although I'd been accustomed to navigating for hours through this visual landscape in previous ayahuasca journeys, at this nexus in this particular journey I felt exhausted and that I didn't have the strength to manage that. I had the sensation that I was underwater and that it was very difficult for me to breathe and that I was potentially going to drown. At that point, I began moaning for help. I raised my hand for assistance from my 2 friends who were facilitating the journey, and they came and got me and helped me walk through the room outside to a veranda, where I began to explain to them that I felt like I was going to die and that I didn't want to go out like this. They didn't help the situation when they told me that we all go through some experience of our own death at some point during ayahuasca journeys. I told them that I'd already experienced that death hours ago, and that at this stage I was attempting to live and that I really needed their help. They gave me some water to drink, which tasted weird, and then I got the idea in my head that they were trying to poison me, and I began spitting out this water or vomiting it out, the water that I thought was poisoned, and I was then convinced that I was vomiting up blood and that I was dying, which freaked me out even further. For some reason, I guess because I seemed relatively coherent and could communicate with them, they thought that I was okay, which I assured them that I wasn't. But they said another friend who was apparently worse off than me needed their attention. So one of them stayed with me while the other went to help my friend. Now, after a while of sitting with my friend who was assuring me that I was going to be okay, I calmed down a bit and I was kind of drifting back and forth back into the inner world. And at one stage I came back to consciousness when he began to tell me not to bite him, which I didn't realize that I was doing. I apologized, and then I unconsciously continued to begin to suck on his elbow. Whilst in this state, I was struggling to comprehend where I was, even though I was at my own home. I was struggling to comprehend who I was, what I did for work regularly. I found that I was in a complete state of fetal or even cellular consciousness at that point. Now, after about another 20 minutes or so went by, I felt sufficiently functional again. I'd regained a sense of my identity, and I was able to return back into the group to continue to navigate this journey solo. So I came back from the balcony, lay down on my mattress, and for about the next 45 minutes or so, my consciousness seemed to begin to fractally reconstruct myself, as though piecing together these geometric light filaments into my body, whilst I was watching this feminine form of the ayahuasca spirit visually morph into infinite forms, whilst showing me that she could become anything that she wished. I was trying to move my limbs, but every time I did, I had this experience of falling through my body, as though my energy body or spirit wasn't quite unified. The feminine ayahuasca spirit that I was interacting with just continued to remind me to stop trying to control anything and just surrender. And each time I practiced this, I'd move from the experience of struggle to one of peace and bliss. So, although I've conveyed this journey in a very condensed form, the events took perhaps 6 hours. It's very common for the effects of psychedelic encounters with the likes of ayahuasca to have a sense of completion quite abruptly, where all of a sudden you may realize that you're back in your regular state of consciousness. At the conclusion of this particular journey, that was the case for me. When I was back in my regular state of consciousness, I started to reflect on all the elements that had occurred, and I realized that the entire experience had been an ongoing process of reliving my birth. So I'd spent a lot of time in the womb having this sense of being in a cosmic ocean. My body was convulsing with the energy in preparation for this birthing event. I'd been interacting with a transcendent aspect of my consciousness, my higher self. Fear and other emotions began to set in as I sensed the event horizon of the birth. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating, being poisoned, and potentially about to die. Then I began looking for a nipple in my mouth, which turned out to be my friend's elbow. This all concluded with interactions with this female spirit that Carl Jung may refer to as the animal or the divine feminine archetype within the collective unconscious. So I also want to quickly state that there is always more to integrate from these types of ceremonies than just what occurs in them. They are often a catalyst for a deep spiritual opening that can take months or years to fully integrate. A lot of material that's buried within the unconscious is flooded into conscious awareness. And the guidance of a therapist who has some awareness of transpersonal psychology, shamanic ways of knowing, grief, bodywork, and other clinical experience is invaluable throughout the process of integrating the material that has arisen after such a journey. With all that in mind, I'm going to suggest that anyone that is going to experiment with the use of psychedelics, either therapeutically or recreationally, may want to develop some comprehension about the next element that I'm going to introduce into this talk, which is about the concept of perinatal experiences. Perinatal refers to the types of experiences that were encountered in the womb and during the birthing process. So, because of the powerful effects that psychedelic compounds found in plant medicines such as ayahuasca or LSD or magic mushrooms can have, which rapidly dissolve ego boundaries and our usual protective defense mechanisms, various types of unresolved perinatal experiences can arise for integration spontaneously during these psychedelic trips. These types of experience that I've just detailed in my own ayahuasca journey, as foreign as they may sound to some people, when put in context of the process of resolving birthing trauma, actually follow a sequence of events which Stanislov Grof describes in several of his books as Basic Perinatal Matrices. According to Stanislov Grof, perinatal experiences refer to the fetus's experience whilst in its mother's womb and during the clinical stages of labour and delivery. It was during the period that Grof used LSD therapeutically with his patients that the clinical observations that he made within these sessions provided insight into the structure and experience of the perinatal birthing experiences. These matrices correspond roughly to the different stages of the child's development in the uterus and its journey through the birthing canal. The first of these 4 basic perinatal matrices correspond to a time of conception up until the first intrauterine contractions. It is associated with the amniotic universe, the period within the maternal womb where the fetus is in a symbiotic unity with the maternal organism, having a lack of boundaries and obstructions. So during this intrauterine experience, the characteristics are generally associated with primarily positive feelings of floating, warmth, connectedness, and having all the child's needs met. These would be associated with an encounter of the good womb. However, depending on the circumstances, the experience of a bad womb or a combination of both may be encountered due to stress hormones from the mother, which might create anxiety in utero. Conversely, nurturing hormones can create the pleasant feelings associated with the good womb. So the second basic perinatal matrice lasts during the time of intrauterine contractions to the entering of the birth canal. During this period, the chemistry in the womb changes and strong contractions push against the fetus that interrupt its nourishment. It consists of the sense of cosmic engulfment with no exit. This begins during the onset of labor and is an extreme alteration to the blissful connection with the mother and the child's original pristine universe in the mother's womb, where during this phase strong feelings are encountered, including intense fear, powerlessness, victimization, and often guilt. At this point, the cervix has not yet dilated, which results in a sense that there is no way out, contributing to a sense of hopelessness. People who were traumatized during this phase of their birth in later life may encounter feelings of claustrophobia, existential angst, depression, terror, or other negative consequences. The third basic perinatal matrice is completed at the time of passage of the fetus through the birth canal. This is the period of the death-rebirth struggle, which entails the movement through the birth canal and a struggle for survival. When the cervix has dilated enough to allow movement through the birth canal, the experience of struggle, aggression, giving and receiving pain, and sexual charge begin. All the these components are needed to activate the life force within the child as it approaches a new encounter of life in the world. Finally, the fourth basic perinatal matrice is represented from the beginning of birth as an independent body and is associated with birth and release. The encounter with ego death appears in this fourth perinatal matrice. This matrix is related to the stage of delivery and the actual birth of the child, where the build-up of tension, pain, and anxiety is suddenly released. The symbolic counterpart is the death-rebirth experience, in which the individual may have strong feelings of impending catastrophe and may be desperately struggling to stop the process. The transition from the third to fourth matrice may involve a sense of total annihilation. The experience of ego death seems to entail an instant, merciless destruction of all previous reference points in the life of the individual. According to Stanislov Grof, what dies in this process is basically a paranoid attitude towards the world, which reflects the negative experience of the subject during childbirth. If the birthing process is completed successfully and the infant reconnects with the mother, this leads to a state that is positive, like the first matrice, but qualitatively different. Various experiences that may be described as spiritual encounters later in life, both positive and negative, that may be experienced as heavenly or hellish, have links with these transitory phases in the birth. One of the more remarkable elements of Grof's work is the evidence provided for the presence of consciousness even in the early stages of gestation, as well as the extreme sensitivity of the fetus to its developing environment, which may result in trauma during the very early stages of the child's life, both in the womb and during the labor and delivery process. Experiences that are affecting the mother emotionally will also be encountered chemically by the developing child, along with external chemicals that may be ingested into the mother's body or exposure to disturbing external stimuli that are encountered by the mother. Grof coined the term coex systems, which means systems of condensed experience, to explain how the human brain organizes related experiences around a powerful emotional center. Trauma will lead to the formation of coex roots, powerful and emotionally charged experiences that become imprinted in the neural structures of the brain. He explains that the majority of negative coex roots are developed in the perinatal period, and once established, these coex roots act as magnetic attractors for similar experiences later in life, becoming further enforced within our inner psychological encounters with the outer world that result in dysfunction. So much of what we encounter throughout later episodes of psychological or psycho-spiritual development in our lives may be viewed as an attempt to resolve the earliest developments of post-traumatic stress disorder that occurred before we were even born. Trauma that is so deeply repressed within the unconscious that, in my personal experience, tends to be relived emotionally through our felt sense experience in the body, rather than having perhaps visual recollection of events such as those that we may recall from earlier in our childhood experiences. Stanislov Grof's work, both that involving the use of psychedelic compounds or that of holotropic breathwork, aim at invoking the repressed memories that are stored as coexsystems and their roots, in order to clear them and reinstate preferable psychological functioning, which results in a more positive encounter with reality. So I hope that this presentation about my own rebirthing process during this encounter with the shamanic plant medicine ayahuasca, in conjunction with an introduction into the insights gleaned by Stanislov Grof's understanding of the basic perinatal matrices, may be of some use to you in your own journey. If you like what has been shared in this presentation and wish to be updated with more episodes of Future Self Dreaming, please hit the subscribe button. You can find counseling sessions online or in person that can be booked on the website futureselfdreaming.com, and you can follow Future Self Dreaming on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you for listening. In Lakesh.